Isn't it great to have a newspaper of record in this town that does the heavy lifting as Big J journalists? Gosh, they're so good at their jobs. They really are. Kansas City Star writing this yesterday afternoon about Josh Hawley. Headline, Josh Hawley called Kamala Harris's nomination rigged. Is he undermining the election?
How dare you?
Oh, man. Here we go. Kansas City Star writing here, Senator Josh Hawley was clear about his word choice. He said rigged. Is that word not allowed to be used? Is that word off limits or something? Is that something that, he shouldn't have said? I'm just trying to understand the first sentence.
Apparently it's been added to the list to refer something.
Is it better if he said the election was transitioning? Would that have been a better word choice by Josh Hawley?
Yep.
Hawley told the Kansas City Star a few days after Joe Biden ended his presidential campaign and the party quickly aligned behind Kamala Harris, quote, they're rigging their own elections, I believe is my exact phrase, and they are. They're totally rigging it. Harris, writes the Star, accepted the Democratic nomination for president in Chicago last week, capping off an unlikely ascension that appears to have injected enthusiasm into the Democratic Party. But as Democrats spent the last month learning what Brat Summer means and donating to Harris, Republicans like Hawley have sought to cast doubt on the new nominee. Well, because no one's ever voted for her. Not a single American voter ever voted for Kamala Harris for president. And instead of Joe Biden dropping out and there being potentially a sprint of a 5-week primary, where then the delegates in Chicago would do their jobs and actually vote for somebody, the powers that be, the donor class, decided Kamala's our person and everybody's going to get in line. Typically, the whole point of a delegate in a situation like this would actually be to represent your fellow citizens and go to Chicago and have kind of an open primary and a debate of ideas and then select a candidate. That's like the perfect scenario where delegates actually would matter. Right now, delegates are figureheads who get to go to these events and party for a week. But this would have actually put the delegates to use. But the donor class and the big power brokers in the party said, no, Kamala's the person. So Josh Hawley is right to point this out and call it rigged. In the sense that the average Democratic voter really had no say in any of this. And if you're a Democrat, you should kind of be teed off about it, I would think, unless you're just kind of like mindless lemmings and saying, well, if this is what Obama wants, this is what I will do. This is how it goes.
I think more of them are like, whew.
Maybe that's
gone,
it.
I think.
Yeah, true. Anything's a step up from Grandpa. Yeah. That's exactly right.
The bar is not very high.
Yeah. So the Star goes on the right. Election experts. So now Josh Hawley's random comment to reporters has them writing this whole piece yesterday. And now we've got the election experts involved. Election experts have repeatedly stressed that Democrats were legally allowed to switch their nominee before the convention. It hasn't stopped Republicans from using words like rigged to describe Harris's nomination. I love how we need election experts to remind us that Democrats were legally allowed to switch out their nominee. We know they were. We're not saying that was illegal. It's just clear that it wasn't actually about the voters deciding a new nominee. That's not what this was about over the last month and a half. The Star writes here, a common refrain has even begun to spread among former Donald Trump supporters that Harris won the nomination without a single vote. Well, that is true. That's entirely accurate. A common refrain has begun to spread. You mean a fact has begun to spread?
Common refrain.
So then they quote this guy. His name is Daniel Weiner. He's an election expert at Brennan Center for Justice. Of course, the Kansas City Star would go to an election expert with the last name Weiner. I mean, that just perfectly comes together, does it not? What is an election expert, by the way? What does that mean? But of all the election experts, I put up my air quotes all over the country, the Kansas City Star finds a guy named Weiner. It's just too perfect. So Daniel Weiner says to the Kansas City Star in this next paragraph, quote, "It appears to be an attempt to transform what was admittedly an unusual situation with a presumptive nominee stepping aside into something nefarious, when in fact the entire process from start to finish has been completely lawful," says Weiner. No one's saying it's not lawful. We're saying for the party that has screamed about democracy for the last 4 years to then pick a nominee that was never voted on by anybody in a primary, and in a theoretical situation where you would actually have delegates who would do their job and you would have some kind of an open primary setup where delegates would then select a nominee in this unique situation, instead of doing that and letting the people theoretically have a voice, you basically browbeat everyone into going with Kamala Harris. That's what you did. So no one's saying what happened here isn't lawful. But the Kansas City Star is writing this massive piece about how Josh Hawley is calling Kamala Harris's nomination rigged, which you can make a very strong case that it is. And then I'm several paragraphs in, and all I've got is conjecture, opinion, and quotes from some guy who's a wiener. That's all I've got. Well, I mean, that's his name. What are you laughing at, Mark? I mean, what's so funny in there? The guy's a wiener. It's his last name.
D. Wiener, right?
Yeah, he's D. Wiener. So now I'm trying to figure out where the story is going. They write here, in an era of stark partisan division, it's become increasingly common for politicians to use language questioning the legitimacy of the democratic process when an election does not go their way. Here we go. Stolen election, January 6th. All right, we're off to the races in the Kansas City Star. That's where they really wanted to get this whole story to. They really just want to remind you, hey, Josh Hawley, January 6th, that's really all this story was intended to be about. Instead of actually looking at Josh Hawley's words and saying, okay, does this make sense? Is Josh Hawley right to point out that Democratic primary voters had no say in what happened in their own party over the last several weeks? The answer to that is yes. No doubt about it, the answer is yes. And that's the point. I can save you 1,500 words. 1,500 words by saying what Josh Hawley said is accurate. I don't need to quote some election expert named Weiner. I don't have to do any of that. 913-408-7957. Let's go up north. Dan is in North KC. What's up, Dan?
Hey, good morning, guys. Always a good conversation with you guys. Hey, the question I have is, isn't the reason that they chose Harris is because they were going to lose all of that campaign funding that was designated for Biden?
Yes. Yes, Dan, great question. I'm glad you brought that up. The only way that they could keep the hundreds of millions of dollars they had raised for Joe Biden was for Kamala Harris to roll it over into her campaign. She's the only person that could have used that money. That's why she always had the leg up. It's not that they thought she was the best candidate. God knows she isn't. She's a complete empty pantsuit. But where are you going to go with the $100 million you've raised for Joe? The only person it could go to is her. The other people would have been starting from scratch. That's why they looked at the field and they said, well, we got to put this money to use. Jonathan's in Kansas City. Hey, Jonathan, go ahead. You're on KCMO.
You know, I've said for a while, Josh Hawley, I think, is the best senator in the Senate. I think he's one of the most conservative, certainly one of the most competent. I think he's one of the best senators in the Senate. I've heard political podcasters like Red Eagle Politics say that. I could see him running in president in the future. I think when you have people in the conservative movement who are more effective, they get attacked more. And I think the other reason they get attacked more is not just because they're effective at influencing the movement, they're effective at getting the wins on the board. You know, I don't know if you remember. I remember voting for him in 2018. They weren't sure he was going to win that election. They were like, well, it could be a coin flip. Mm-hmm. He ended up getting 5-6 points over Claire McCaskill, who was horrible. And now it's double digits. Like, there's not even a contest. And I understand part of it's the tilt of the state, but you know, if he were less competent, you know, that there would probably be a narrower margin, you know, like you see with some of these rhinos sometimes. So I think when you have an effective leader in the conservative movement who can, you know, steer the direction of that movement and they're effective at it, yeah, they're going to get attacked more. And I don't know. I just think that's why he gets attacked more by people like.
Well, he's an easy punching bag, Jonathan, for the Kansas City Star. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. He's an easy punching bag for them, and they get their jollies doing it. And in this case, he's right. But you know what? It gets them some clicks from Prairie Village and Wokewood and places like that.